Welcome back. Now, EFF leader Julius Malema's private members' bill aimed at nationalising the South African Reserve Bank received mixed reactions during public hearings. COSATU, the National Treasury, and other organisations made submissions before the Standing Committee on Finance 7 years after the bill was first introduced in Parliament. Now, COSATU's Tony Ehrenreich said that they had supported this move. Joining me now is the Trade Union's Parliamentary Coordinator, Matthew Parks. Matthew, always a pleasure having you on. Thank you so much for joining us.
Good afternoon. Thank you for having us.
No, absolute pleasure. This is, of course, what Mr. Ehrenreich had said, Matthew. The ownership of the South African Reserve Bank must only be vested with the state in line with international norms. So this international norms, are you able to expand on that, please?
Sure. So South Africa is a bit of an outlier in this regard. All countries do have reserve banks. And by and large, I think 99% of the world, all of them are owned by their state because they've got a public function to fulfill, a function and a role the private sector can't do naturally given its tasks of managing a currency, managing inflation, but also overseeing the domestic banks as well, the private sector banks. And so for some anachronism in history, long before we became a democratic state in 1994, the Reserve Bank provided for private shareholders within it. The minority shareholders, the bank as a whole, under the Constitution, under the Reserve Bank Act itself, is a publicly owned institution. It's got a public mandate of protecting the value of the rand, managing inflation, protecting workers' salaries from being eroded by inflation, overseeing the banks in the economy, public and private banks. But we have this weird anachronism where you have some private sector shareholders within it. And so there's been a little bit of a political irritant in the domestic political discourse. Why do you have these private shareholders? So the bill basically simply says the Reserve Bank, like international norms, like our peers in the US, in Europe, in Japan, China, India, Brazil, etc., the Reserve Bank should be fully owned by the state on behalf of the public. And so they just simply seeks to remove the private shareholders who are minority shareholders. And we support that objective. This has been a long discussion. It's an unnecessary political distraction in society. And we think there is a need to finally conclude this chapter and just find a path to ensure the state becomes a sole shareholder in the Reserve Bank.
Matthew, if I stand to be correct, I think there's 12,000 shareholders that form part of the South African Reserve Bank. And you've mentioned it, of course, that a minority of them are private shareholders. Now, majority, of course, some of them will have a say in the way this business will be conducted. So, I mean, is there a sort of way of having a discussion with these minority shareholders should, of course, this become an absolute reality? What actually happens to those minority shareholders in a case like this?
Well, so we have the Expropriation Act for when the state does acquire property, whether it's land or there's other types of property. There's a process for compensation to be determined. The state will have to determine the value of those private shares and come to a price for them in rands and cents. And then to say, can the fiscus afford it? How much can the fiscus afford? Over what period in time? And then to basically go and to acquire those private shares. That's in essence what you would need to do. The bill doesn't speak to that, which is one of the points that Treasury and the Reserve Bank raised, that you need to do so. But I think from our side, we have an Expropriation Act which governs how the state must deal with such issues of acquisition of property. In this case, it would be the acquisition of shares. So I think for us, the Expropriation Act will then simply kick into effect, and it's quite a detailed legislative framework about how the state goes about acquiring property, how is compensation determined, what are the timeframes, etc. Of course, we must also bear in mind what the Minister for Finance has raised previously on this issue. The fiscus has limited resources. There are many equally pressing claims on fiscal support, from unemployment assistance to social relief to fixing the state, fixing the SOE, stimulating the economy, all the many important things. And so this might have to juggle for space in the queue of relief from the state, and that's fine. Those are modalities. The state can tell us, look, we have money, we can do this immediately. Or the state might tell us, look, this is going to be quite an expensive process. Perhaps we can roll those out incrementally over a few years, 5 years, 10 years, whatever logistics and logic may dictate. But ultimately, I think we all agree And I doubt there'll be many people who would disagree that the state shouldn't be the sole shareholder of the Reserve Bank. The issue the Treasury raised in the hearings in the Reserve Bank too about the signal to markets. So we need to manage and communicate these things maturely, sensitively, soberly, because they're worried about will it spark investor confidence? Will people think this is going to undermine the mandate, the role, the autonomy of the Reserve Bank? We don't think so, because those things are provided for in the Constitution, in the Reserve Bank Act. It wouldn't be a fundamental shift in that regard, because they already stipulate in law that the Reserve Bank is owned by the state. So that's not changing. What you do is simply having an off-ramp for the minority shareholders who don't have a majority say, as the Reserve Bank has pointed out. The executive, the Minister for Finance, already appoints the governor of the Reserve Bank, appoints the deputy governors, etc. So again, that's not a fundamental shift in that regards. But I think, given what we've seen for us over this year, fake news on social media, of hysteria, let me say some lunatic elements out there in the political discourse, we do need to manage it soberly so we don't send a wrong message over what should really be, I think, for most of us, a consensus that the state should be the sole shareholder in the Reserve Bank, as per norms in Britain, the US, Japan, etc.
Interesting and of course, National Treasury is not here to answer this, but I'm going to get, COSATU's take on this, because a comment from Christopher Axelson, who's the National Treasury's Deputy Director for Tax and Financial Sector Policy, had said the governance arrangements could also be weaker and may negatively impact the independence of the Reserve Bank, and so we do not support the bill. Okay, the independence of the Reserve Bank, if by this private members bill, is the independence in danger, as what Christopher Axelson is saying right now from Treasury?
No, we don't think so. Because the state already is the majority shareholder in the Reserve Bank. We're talking about minority shareholders. The Reserve Bank, the governor, Lesetja Kganyago, is a very eloquent, forthright person. He doesn't beat about the bush. He has already said these minority shareholders don't have a fundamental say or influence over how the Reserve Bank exercises its mandate, how it fulfills its duties, etc. The Minister of Finance, the executive, on behalf of whom he acts as a minister, appoints the governor. They appoint the deputy governors. They give the mandate around inflation targets, around fiscal monetary policy, and so forth. So those wouldn't change. But I think the point that the DDG from Treasury, Chris Axelson, made was about the signal and the perception. And so that's a fair point. We wouldn't want to have a wrong perception created that this is going to undermine the Reserve Bank's autonomy. It's going to undermine its ability to perform its duties according to the law, to the Constitution, etc. So one needs to communicate properly. And so there is going to be a need for a consensus approach between the executive, Treasury, the Reserve Bank, Parliament, political parties across Parliament, COSATU, business, etc., to say, but look, this is a common sense approach. What we don't want, and I think was a point that Chris from Treasury raised, what I think he intended, and we appreciate that point, is to send a wrong signal. We don't want to have, like with the Expropriation Act, which is really a common sense, sober legislation to govern expropriation issues, become a political football. We don't want that. So I think there is a need to kind of avoid emotional slogan-leaning on one side, and also avoid emotional fear-mongering on the other side. So I think majority of us across the political spectrum would agree a Reserve Bank should be owned by the state on behalf of the public, because it's got a public function to fulfill, including overseeing the role of private banks, etc. So, and again, that's not a new thing. This is not something we've invented from thin air. That's what you have in Britain. That's what you have across the world. And I think it's just about how to manage it delicately so that you don't create uncertainty. So if the Treasury says, look, we can do this over the next 5 years, etc., then fine, we can have that kind of a discussion.
Matthew, we've just got 2 minutes. You mentioned sober discussion, sober thinking is going to have to come. Of course, there's the Government of National Unity. We've got partners within the GNU, and I say we talk about the country, that as, of course, decisions or a part of their constitutions within their various parties saying that the Reserve Bank should not be nationalized. Of course, we've got your alliance partner, the African National Congress, that, of course, is going to enter this conversation. And of course, you've got President Cyril Ramaphosa along with Treasury that are going to enter this conversation. The Reserve Bank is important. You've spoken of the autonomy of it. The sober thinking is, sober discussions are going to have to be done in a way that doesn't really rattle trade within this country, and of course the fiscus, as you mentioned, within this country.
No, exactly. So I think we do need to learn the lessons over the past year in terms of our domestic political scenario, in terms of international geopolitical scenarios, and of course bearing in mind our very fragile economic growth rate, high levels of unemployment, the need to attract investors. So we need to manage it delicately. And this is why we would appeal to political parties across Parliament, all of them, from A to Z, just to be a little bit mature. I don't think any of us would really disagree with the principal objective of the bill, which said the state should be the sole shareholder of the Reserve Bank. It can't be a private bank. And so then I think it becomes a question of modalities and time and processes. How do you effect it? We don't think this thing would be done tomorrow. Bills on their own take about a year, 2 years to go through Parliament, for example. And because the Expropriation Act governs how the state acquires property, it would guide that process around the minority shareholders. And if the fiscus, if the Treasury says, look, we can only afford to do this over a period of 5, 10 years, that's fine. They can say we will buy incrementally the shares at 10% a year for the next decade. We'll be concluded this process over that period of time, just for theoretical examples, for the sake of debate. That's fine. But I think all of us need to ratchet down the rhetoric. On the one hand, for people who are scaremongering or fear-mongering, doesn't help, because we can't blame people to say this is the end of life as we know it,
Sure.
if people have helped stoke those fires. And equally, those on the other extreme should also avoid presenting this as some sort of major shift, because it's not a major shift. The state is the majority shareholder, always says that it should be the sole shareholder, not the only, shouldn't have minority shareholdings.
Matthew Parks, COSATU's parliamentary coordinator. Always a pleasure having you on. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
That's Matthew Parks, of course, from COSATU, the largest trade union organization here in South Africa. Of course, up next, you've seen her. She's waiting for the conversation. Sandra Makwashe from the South African Human Rights Commission. They're raising concerns over allegations that there are foreign nationals who are being barred from accessing healthcare services. That conversation is up next.